I'm going to tell you about 3 tricks that asylum officers commonly use so they'll have an excuse to deny someone. If we're just now meeting, my name is Brian Manning and I'm a political asylum lawyer. I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now, as a lawyer, I help people from all over the country to secure their future in the United States through asylum. Now, don't get me wrong, most asylum officers are good and professional and honest. However, there are some bad ones. Actually, there are some who are just straight up anti-immigrant and they're actually looking for an excuse to deny your case. And one of the most common ways they do this is through what's called a negative credibility finding, where if you have a few what they call inconsistencies in your case, they can say, oh, there were too many inconsistencies, therefore you're not credible and we don't believe you, and so therefore you're denied. And so some officers go out of their way to try to trip you up, to try to get you during your interview to say something that doesn't line up with something you've said earlier or with something that was in your documents for your case. So they can say, oh, that's an inconsistency. Those two things contradict each other or don't match up, and therefore you're not credible. And here are 3 little tricks that I've seen asylum officers use a lot to make this negative credibility finding based on inconsistencies. Number 1, they ask if you've ever lied to an immigration officer or ever misrepresented anything or ever covered anything up. Basically, whether you've ever done anything dishonest or in a way that was trying to be evasive with regard to anything you've said to a U.S. immigration officer or any U.S. immigration applications that you've submitted. They'll often ask this near the beginning of the interview so that you sort of forget about it. And then what happens is later, near the end of the interview, they'll say something like, now, when you left your country, you were doing it to flee persecution or feared persecution, right? You were doing it to try to get away. Is that right? And the person will say, well, yeah, that's true. And they'll say, well, was that the reason that you went to go get your US visa so that you could get out of the country? And the person will say, yeah, I was trying to flee persecution. And then the asylum officer says, well, that's interesting because here on my screen, I have a record of your application for a US visa. And in it, you say that your purpose of travel to the United States is for tourism, or maybe you came on a student visa or even a business visa, whatever the case. And the asylum officer will say, you're telling me today that you applied for a US visa and you came to the United States for the purpose of fleeing persecution. You wanted to come and claim asylum here and stay here long term. And earlier you told me that you've never lied or misrepresented anything to an immigration officer, however. However, in your US visa application, you said you wanted to come for tourism. And at your US visa interview, you probably told them that your purpose of travel was tourism, right? And you didn't say anything about wanting to come get asylum or to flee persecution, did you? Well, this can be considered an inconsistency. That's 1 strike against you. So you need to think before your asylum interview about what your state of mind was before you ever applied for a US visa. If you intended to come to the United States to seek asylum and therefore you were lying or at least covering something up when you applied for a visa, then just be honest about it. Tell the truth. It's not a problem, actually. You just have to be cognizant of it and you got to be straightforward and honest about it. Also, you got to think about what you said at the airport when you came to the United States, when the Customs and Border Protection officer asked you as you were about to enter the country, what's the purpose of your travel? Did you tell them the truth or did you say that you wanted to come for tourism or whatever when you really intended to seek asylum? Now, a lot of people do come here not planning to seek asylum and then something happens, something changes such that they later decide they have to stay here and seek safety here. So that's a different situation. Number 2 on our list of sneaky tricks that asylum officers use to try to find an excuse to deny applicants. They ask whether the declaration or the written or personal statement that you supplied with your application materials contains all incidents in it of past harm or threats. In other words, they're asking you, okay, I understand that some things happened in the past and you wrote a declaration about these things. Does that declaration talk about all the things that have happened to you, or are there some additional things like bad things that have happened, harm or threats that you did not discuss in your declaration? But they don't usually explain it that clearly. They just say something like, does your declaration contain reference to all incidents of harm or threats? And most people aren't prepared for this question. They just think quickly and say, yeah, it does, yeah. Well, what happens is later in the interview, you may be talking about what's happened and you may add something that wasn't contained in your personal statement. Like, let's say your personal statement says that you received 4 threatening phone calls and then you mention another one that would be a 5th one. Even if you have a good reason for explaining your story the way that you did, where you talked in detail about the ones, 3 or 4 biggest ones in your declaration, and then you want to mention something at the asylum interview later about an additional one because it's relevant based on what the asylum officer is asking you. It may be totally reasonable to do that, But the officer can still find an inconsistency here because, hey, earlier I asked you whether your declaration, every single incident of harm and threat that you received in your country, and you said yes, but now you're telling me about an additional one. That's an inconsistency. What can you do to guard against this? Well, in the initial stages, when you're writing your declaration, you can use language that indicates that you're not necessarily talking in your statement about everything that's ever happened to you, but rather you're focusing on what you think at that time are some of the most important things. You could consider saying something like, a lot has happened to me, and I want to tell you about just a few of the biggest things in this declaration. That way you haven't suggested that your declaration is some kind of all-inclusive document that contains every single thing that it could possibly contain about what's happened to you. This also reminds me how important it is to emphasize that you've got to know what's in your declaration. You have to be intimately familiar with everything that you've said in your personal statement. Even if you wrote it years ago, well, you got to go back and you got to study it. Number 3 on our list of sneaky things an asylum officer may do to try to deny you. Did they say anything else? You're going to get this question over and over again at your asylum interview. If you've ever had any kind of interaction with someone where you've been harmed or threatened, the officer wants to know what they said. They're going to say, what did they say? What did they say? What did they say? Did they say anything else? Did they say anything else? Over and over again. This is important to the officer to be able to analyze your case and determine whether you're eligible for asylum. But it's also used as a trap. Let's say that the declaration that you wrote says that the bad guys called you one day and they said A, B, C, and D, okay? And then at your asylum interview, when you're talking about this same incident, this phone call, you say, yeah, they said A, B, and C. Well, the officer can say, oh, okay, they said A, B, and C, I get it. Did they say anything else? And you might forget and not think about D, the other thing they said, and say, not that I can think of, or I don't remember. Well, the officer can see this as an inconsistency, they'll say, your declaration says they said A, B, C, and D. Today you only told me about A, B, and C. I asked you whether they said anything else, and you said no. Therefore, you've told me 2 different things about what they said. That's an inconsistency. This is just another reason why you've got to be familiar with all of the details of any documents that you've submitted. Everything you say in your asylum application, as well as supporting documents like the personal statement that you submit with it. Again, I'm Brian Manning. I'm a political asylum lawyer, and my law firm helps people all over the country to get asylum in the United States. Call us if you want our help or you want to talk about your case. My number is 713-909-0401. Again, 713-909-0401. Thanks so much, and it's my honor to support you in your immigration journey.